The Mafia boss thought his black Maid hated him, until he discovered her secret sacrifice. The mansion was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that settled in only when something was terribly wrong. Inside the massive, marble-walled living room, a child's cry echoed faintly through the hallway, his sobs broken and desperate. It wasn't the first time young Marco had cried out in such pain. The doctors had come and gone, offering solutions that never worked. His mother, gone for weeks now, left a hole that neither money nor medicine could fill. Dominic Valentino, the Mafia boss, stood in the grand foyer, his face hard as stone. His usual calm demeanor was shattered, replaced by frustration. He'd spent years building an empire, running everything with ruthless efficiency, but now, standing in the hallway, he was powerless. His son's pain was something he couldn't control. Marco had been suffering for weeks. No matter what they tried, nothing eased the little boy's pain. The boy's condition was a mystery, one that all the money in the world couldn't solve. Dominic clenched his fists, pacing back and forth, his mind racing with helpless thoughts. He should have been able to fix this. He could crush anyone in his way, destroy any enemy. But his son? He was losing that battle. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Swelly Carter, the maid who had worked for the Valentino family for almost 2 years now. Swelly was an enigma to him, quiet, reserved, always in the background. She never sought attention. To Dominic, she was just another member of the staff, invisible and insignificant in the grand scheme of his world. Yet today, her presence seemed different. He noticed the way she moved, the way her gaze lingered on Marco, even as she kept her distance. Swelly had always been a mystery to him, her expression unreadable, her demeanor cold but not without a certain strength that made her hard to ignore. She was a woman of few words, one who kept to herself, never bothering anyone. But today, something in the air felt different. She had been the one to care for Marco when no one else could. It was Swelly who had been there when the boy was first brought home from the hospital, when he was still so small, so fragile. But as the days passed, her silence grew louder to Dominic. He couldn't help but wonder why she was still here. There were other maids, other workers who could do the job. Why had she stayed? It wasn't her role to care for Marco beyond the basics. She wasn't family. And yet, every time the boy cried, she was there. But what puzzled him most was the way she seemed to understand Marco in a way that no one else could. He watched as she knelt by Marco's side, whispering softly to him, her hands brushing his feverish forehead. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The mansion, the people, the chaos. It was just Swelly and the boy. She was the calm in the storm. And in that moment, as Dominic watched her, something shifted in him. He felt something deep inside, a stirring that he couldn't explain. The hard edges of his world suddenly felt softer, blurred by the vulnerability that seemed to radiate from Swelly as she comforted his son. What was it that made her do this? What was the secret she was hiding? He could no longer deny it. He needed to know. He needed to understand why she seemed to care so much for Marco. It was a mystery that demanded answers. And as he stood there, watching the woman who had been so invisible in his world, Dominic realized something. There was more to her than he had ever imagined. And whatever it was about to change everything. Dominic couldn't stop thinking about Swelly as he paced back and forth in the grand living room of the Valentino mansion. The moment he saw her whispering to Marco, gently comforting his son, something inside him had shifted. He had always thought of her as just a maid, one of the many servants who filled the house, always there but never noticed. But today, he couldn't ignore the way she seemed to understand Marco in a way no one else could. Why was she so different? Why did she care so much? It wasn't like Swelly to engage with him directly, and yet here she was, an invisible woman in his world, suddenly making herself impossible to ignore. He couldn't stop the questions from swirling in his mind. What was her story? What made her stay in his home, with all the wealth and power at her disposal, doing menial work day after day? Dominic had built his empire from the ground up, fighting for everything he had. But none of that prepared him for the feeling that now consumed him. The feeling of helplessness as he stood watching his son in pain, a pain that he couldn't fix. His world of control, of power, of money, none of it mattered when it came to Marco's suffering. As the days had passed, Dominic had become more desperate, more impatient. He tried everything, money, power, influence, but nothing worked. Yet here was Swelly, A woman with no power, no money, and no connections, somehow comforting his son when all his wealth and resources had failed. It didn't make sense. Dominic had to know more. He had to understand why she was the one who seemed to have the ability to ease Marco's pain. He walked quietly toward her, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath his feet. She was kneeling beside Marco, her hands gently rubbing his back as the boy calmed down. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him at first, and for a moment, Dominic considered turning away. He wasn't used to seeking anyone's help, let alone from someone he barely knew. But the sight before him, Swelly, so calm and tender with his son, drew him in. "Swelly," he said, his voice gruff, the words unfamiliar to him. She didn't flinch or look up at first. Her silence seemed to stretch for a moment, and then she slowly lifted her head. "Yes, sir." Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength in it. Dominic cleared his throat, trying to mask the vulnerability he felt. You've been with him a lot lately. When no one else could calm him down, you were the one who did." Swelly paused for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "I have experience with children," she replied simply, her gaze moving back to Marco, who was now resting peacefully in her arms. Dominic stood there, uncertain. He wanted to ask her more. He wanted to demand answers. But something held him back. He couldn't bring himself to push her further. Instead, he took a step closer. "Why are you still here, Swelly?" The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. She looked up at him now, her eyes meeting his with an honesty that took him off guard. "I'm here because I care for him. And because," she hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully, "because I lost someone I loved too." The words struck Dominic hard. He wasn't sure why, but they did. He had always thought of Swelly as just a servant, an invisible figure in the background. But now, as he stood there, he realized that she was so much more than that. She was a woman who had known pain, who had known loss. She was a woman who had her own reasons for doing what she did. And it wasn't just for the paycheck. Dominic couldn't help but feel a surge of something. Something like respect, something he hadn't expected. He watched as she gently rocked Marco back and forth, humming softly to him. The boy's breathing had evened out, his tiny fists now relaxed by his side. Dominic realized then that he had never seen his son this calm, this peaceful. Swelly had done something that no one else could. She had reached into the depths of his son's fear and pain and had done what no doctor or nurse could do. She had healed him in a way that went beyond medicine. It was in that moment that Dominic understood there was something about Swelly, something deep. He didn't know what it was yet, but he felt it, and he needed to know more. The following days after that encounter, Dominic couldn't get Swelly out of his mind. The way she had handled Marco with such tenderness, her ability to calm him when no one else could, it was as if she had a magic touch. He had spent so many years building an empire of fear and control, but this woman, this Maid, had done something he couldn't do. She had brought peace to his son. He couldn't understand it, and that lack of understanding gnawed at him. Swelly remained the same as ever, though, quiet, reserved, always in the background, doing her work with no expectation of acknowledgement. She didn't seem to care for the attention, and that only deepened the mystery for Dominic. He watched her from afar, his gaze following her every movement. But still, he couldn't bring himself to speak more with her. He didn't know how. The power dynamic was so clear in his mind. He was the Mafia boss, the one who controlled everything. And she was just a maid. But what if that wasn't all there was to her? What if there was more hidden beneath the surface? It was one late evening, as Dominic sat in his private study, trying to sort through business matters, when he heard soft footsteps approaching his door. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Swelly. She always moved so quietly. She knocked once before entering, her eyes cast downward, as though she were still in her place, still beneath him. But Dominic didn't see it that way anymore. He had started to see her differently. "Sir," she said softly, her voice low and respectful. "Is there anything you need?" Her words were polite, as they always were, but there was something different in her tone today. Something that made Dominic pause, made him look at her in a way he never had before. "Actually," he started, the words surprising even himself, "I wanted to thank you." Swelly blinked, her gaze flickering upward for a brief second before she quickly dropped it again. "Thank me, sir? For what?" Dominic leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. "For calming Marco down." I've never seen him so peaceful. And I don't know how you did it. Swelly stood there silently for a moment, and Dominic noticed how her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly. It's just what I do, she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do anything special. Dominic didn't buy it. There was something in the way she said it. Too humble, too careful. She wasn't being truthful, and he couldn't let it go. No, you're lying, he said, his voice firm but not harsh. You did something special, Swelly, and I want to know what it is. The room grew silent. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Dominic didn't blink, his eyes locked onto hers, willing her to tell him the truth. Swelly hesitated. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. He had never seen her like this before, so uncertain, so vulnerable. I just care for him, she said, her voice barely audible. He reminds me of my own child. The words hit Dominic like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know why, but something about her saying that made him feel like he was seeing her for the first time. The quiet maid who had always been in the background, who had never asked for anything, had lost a child. He saw a new layer of her, a mother's love, a sacrifice he hadn't known about. Dominic's mind reeled as he processed what she had said. He stood up and walked toward her, feeling a strange sense of urgency. What happened to your child? He asked, his voice softer now, as though the walls between them had suddenly disappeared. Swelly's eyes filled with pain, and for the first time since he had met her, she let her guard down. She died, Swelly said, her voice trembling. It was years ago, but I still feel her loss every day. Dominic didn't know how to respond. He had always been a man of action, of power, of control. But this was something entirely different. He wasn't prepared for this kind of vulnerability. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Swelly didn't reply. She just stood there, her back straight, her face blank, as though the weight of her grief was something she had long learned to carry in silence. For a moment, Dominic wondered if he had overstepped, if he had gone too far. But then she looked up at him again, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes, something raw, something real. It's okay, she said softly. I've learned to live with it. But Marco, he's not like my daughter. He's different. He's still here. Dominic's heart clenched. He had never truly understood what it meant to lose someone like that, to carry that kind of pain. But in that moment, as he looked at Swelly, this woman who had given so much of herself to others, he realized how little he had known about her, and how little he had known about himself. He wasn't just the Mafia boss. Not anymore. And neither was she just a maid. The lines between them were beginning to blur, and it scared him. Because for the first time, he saw her as more than just someone in his employ. He saw her as a person, someone with her own pain, her own life, her own sacrifices. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he found himself wanting to know more. The next few days passed in a strange, almost surreal silence. Dominic couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Swelly. Every time he closed his eyes, her words echoed in his mind. He's still here. That was what she had said about Marco. It stuck with him more than anything else she had said. He didn't realize how much it had affected him until he found himself looking for her again. Every time he passed by the hallway, every time he heard a sound in the distance, he expected to see her, standing there, a quiet observer, as she always had been. But now, something had shifted. Now he wanted to know her. He needed to know more about her. The woman who had given everything to care for his son. The woman who had sacrificed so much, even though she had no obligation to. It was a Tuesday morning when he finally saw her again. Swelly was standing in the kitchen, her back to him as she prepared breakfast. The sunlight filtered in through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. She seemed unaware of his presence at first. Dominic paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. He felt a strange sense of urgency, as if something in him had finally snapped into place. Swelly, he called out. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for just a second before quickly looking away. She didn't speak, but her posture became stiff, as if she was preparing for some sort of reprimand. Come here, he said, his voice quieter than before. She hesitated, but then slowly walked over to him, her steps careful. Yes, sir, she asked, her voice polite but distant. It reminded him of how she had always spoken to him, subdued, reserved, never seeking attention. But now, as he looked at her, he saw something different. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of years of quiet sacrifice. He saw a woman who had been through more than he could ever imagine. "Swelly," he began again, this time with more purpose. "I want to apologize. For not understanding before. For not seeing you. For not realizing how much you've done for this family." She looked at him, her gaze softening just a fraction. "It's not necessary, sir," she said quietly. "I do my job. That's all." But Dominic could tell that there was more to it than that. She was used to being invisible, used to not being seen or heard. He knew she didn't expect recognition, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen in her. The quiet strength, the unspoken love for his son, the sacrifice she had made. "No, it is necessary," he replied firmly. "You've been more than just a maid to this family. You've been a mother to Marco when no one else could be." Swelly looked down, a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, flashed across her face. "I never wanted anyone to think of me as a replacement for his mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic stepped closer, his heart tightening at the thought. He knew she didn't mean it that way. She wasn't trying to replace anyone. She was just helping, loving, caring. She had filled the gap when no one else could. "You're not a replacement, Swelly," he said softly. "You're a woman who's giving everything for someone else. You're giving Marco something I couldn't. You're giving him love. You're giving him peace." Swelly's eyes welled up, but she quickly looked away, wiping a tear from her cheek. Dominic didn't know why, but seeing her so vulnerable, so human, made something inside him break. It was the first time he truly understood. He had spent his life building walls around himself, walls of power and control, and now, for the first time, he realized how empty those walls were. They had kept out so much, including the very thing that mattered the most, connection. "I'm sorry, Swelly," he said again, his voice filled with an honesty he had never shared before. "I haven't been fair to you, and I haven't been fair to Marco, but I want to change that." Swelly was silent for a long moment, and for the first time, she seemed to soften, her guard slipping just a little. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Dominic reached out, touching her shoulder lightly, a gesture of comfort, of connection. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I should be the one thanking you. You've done more for my son than anyone else." For the first time, Swelly met his gaze fully. There was something in her eyes, something broken, but also something strong. "I'm just doing what I can," she said, her voice steady once again. "It's all I know how to do." Dominic nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been blind to so much. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that Swelly wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just an employee. She was a woman who had loved with a depth he hadn't known existed. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never take her, or anyone like her, for granted again. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of discomfort and understanding. Dominic could feel the shift, both within himself and in the way he interacted with Swelly. She was still the quiet maid, doing her job, but now, something had changed between them. There was no longer the invisible barrier of employer and employee, at least not for Dominic. He began to notice the little things about her that he had never cared to see before. The way she moved with purpose, how her eyes would linger on Marco when she thought no one was looking, the gentleness in her voice as she spoke to the staff. But there was more than just a shift in his perception. Dominic found himself drawn to her presence in a way that confused him. He had always been a man who valued control and distance, but Swelly's quiet strength, her unspoken sacrifice, had cracked through the walls he had spent years building. It was a rainy evening when Dominic decided to speak to her again. He had been pacing the halls of the mansion, unable to focus on anything. His thoughts kept returning to her, to Marco, to the truth he was slowly beginning to realize about the life he had built. When he found her again, it was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the family. The sound of the rain against the windows provided a steady backdrop, but inside, the air felt heavy, as if something important was about to happen. Swelly turned as he entered, her face neutral, but her eyes flickered with a mix of caution and something else, something softer. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice calm. Dominic took a deep breath, trying to steady the fluttering nerves in his chest. He had never been good at vulnerability, at opening up to others, but here he was. "Swelly," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "I've been thinking. About everything." She didn't say anything, just nodded slowly, waiting for him to continue. Dominic paused, taking in the sight of her, realizing how little he truly knew about her. You've been here for a long time, he said, and you've done more for this family than anyone could ever ask. I've been selfish, blind, not seeing everything you've been doing. Not just for Marco, but for me, for this family. He could feel his words catching in his throat, but he pushed them out. I never took the time to appreciate you, Swelly. I never even thought to ask what you needed, what you wanted. But I'm asking now. Is there anything you want? Swelly looked up at him, and for a moment, he could see the surprise in her eyes. It wasn't like her to be caught off guard, and for a brief second, she hesitated. I've always had what I needed, sir, she replied softly, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. Dominic stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. That's not enough, he said firmly. Not anymore. I can't keep pretending I don't see you. You've given everything to this family, and I can't ignore it. Swelly lowered her head, her fingers tightening slightly around the towel she was holding. I didn't do it for you, she said quietly. I did it for Marco. For him, not for anyone else. I lost my daughter. I couldn't save her, but I could save him. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion. Dominic felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt before. The weight of her loss, the depth of her sacrifice, hit him like a wave. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to lose a child, to live with that grief every day. But here she was, standing before him, giving everything she had to protect Marco. For the first time, Dominic saw Swelly not as a maid, not as an employee, but as a woman who had lived through unimaginable pain and was still standing. Swelly, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, you didn't just give Marco your care. You gave him your heart. And you've done the same for me, without even realizing it. He faltered, unsure of how to express the feelings that were bubbling to the surface. Swelly turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the rain outside. Then, finally, Swelly broke the silence. I didn't expect anything from you, Dominic. I never did. But I'm here, because I want to be. Because Marco needs me. And, if you'll allow me, I'll continue to help him. Help both of you. Dominic looked at her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't name. She had no idea how much she had changed everything for him. He had spent his life surrounded by power, but Swelly had shown him a different kind of strength. The kind that didn't need to be commanded, but was earned through sacrifice and love. And in that moment, he knew that his life would never be the same. He wasn't sure what would come next. There was still so much he didn't understand, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her go. Thank you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Swelly nodded, her eyes softening. I'm just doing what I can, Dominic. Just what I can. And for the first time in a long time, Dominic allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal, together. The days that followed felt like an odd balance between stillness and change. Dominic had begun to see Swelly in a completely different light. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation in the kitchen, the vulnerability in her eyes when she spoke about her daughter, and the quiet strength she had shown when caring for Marco. But despite the newfound respect and understanding, things were still complicated. Dominic didn't know what to do with the feelings stirring inside him. He was used to being in control, to knowing what came next, but now, with Swelly, it was different. There was no script. There was no game plan. And for the first time in his life, that terrified him. He found himself watching her more often, noticing the way she moved through the house, the way she interacted with Marco. She had become the heartbeat of the house without even trying. Marco, once so fragile and pained, was thriving in her presence. She had become the one constant in his life. Dominic could see the change in his son. He was more relaxed, more at ease. The soft giggles he once thought he'd never hear filled the halls again, and every time he saw Swelly and Marco together, he felt something tug at his heart. He had built his empire with force, with power, and control. He had used money and intimidation to get what he wanted. But with Swelly, things were different. He didn't have the upper hand. He wasn't in control, and that was what unsettled him. It was one evening when Dominic decided to confront the growing feelings inside him. He knew he couldn't continue like this, caught between his admiration for Swelly and his usual, rigid boundaries. He needed to know where they stood. He found her again in the library, sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap as she stared out at the rainy night. She seemed so peaceful, so content, yet there was something about her that seemed lost in thought. Dominic stood in the doorway, his heart racing. He had never been good with emotions, especially when it came to matters of the heart, but he couldn't avoid it anymore. "Swelly," he called, his voice softer than usual. She turned toward him, her expression neutral but the slightest hint of surprise in her eyes. "Sir?" she asked. "Come here," Dominic said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. She rose slowly, her movements graceful as always. "I need to talk to you," he continued, his mind racing. Swelly followed him to the center of the room, her posture straight, her eyes meeting his with a calmness he couldn't quite read. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant. "About everything. About you, about Marco, about the way I've been treating you." Swelly stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. Dominic sighed, feeling a weight pressing down on him. "I've been blind," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I've never truly seen you. Not like this." Swelly looked at him, her brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to understand where he was going with this. "I've always been used to seeing people as part of my world, employees, staff, tools to get things done," he said, his voice low. "But you've changed everything. You've done something that I've never been able to do. You've cared for my son like he was your own, and I can't ignore that anymore. I don't want to." Swelly's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. She just stood there, her hands still at her sides, waiting for him to say more. Dominic took a step closer, his heart racing. "I know I've been distant," he continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "I know I've been cold, but I can't keep pretending. I can't keep pretending I don't see you, that I don't appreciate everything you've done for Marco, for me, for this family." Swelly blinked, her lips parting slightly, but she still didn't speak. "I need you to know something, Swelly," Dominic said, his voice firm now, but with a raw sincerity. "I'm not the same man I was when you first came here. You've changed me, and for the first time, I don't want to be the man I was. I want to be someone different, someone better." The room seemed to hold its breath as Dominic stared into her eyes. He could see the uncertainty there, the hesitation, but he also saw something else, something that made him believe she was starting to see him differently, too. Swelly's eyes finally softened, and she stepped closer to him. "I never expected anything from you, Dominic," she said quietly. "I never asked for your gratitude. I didn't do any of this for you." Dominic nodded, his heart heavy. "I know," he said softly, "but I want to change. I want to show you that I see you, that I see what you've done, and I respect you for it." Swelly remained silent for a moment. Then finally, she spoke. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice steady but her eyes filled with something deeper. "I'm just trying to do right by him." Dominic reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "You've done more than just your job, Swelly," he said quietly. "You've given him something I couldn't. You've given him a future, and for that, I'll never be able to thank you enough." Swelly looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of hope, of something unspoken, a possibility that neither of them had dared to consider. And in that moment, Dominic knew that things between them would never be the same. The walls he had built, the distance he had kept, were starting to crumble, and he wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it. With her, the tension in the air between Dominic and Swelly was undeniable, but it wasn't the same kind of tension he was used to. This wasn't the cold, sharp tension of business or the power plays of Mafia dealings. This was different. It was softer, quieter, and somehow more intense. Dominic had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, but with Swelly, that control was slipping through his fingers. He found himself thinking about her constantly, replaying every conversation they had, every glance shared between them. What was this strange pull he felt toward her? It wasn't just about gratitude for what she had done for Marco. It wasn't just about the way she had calmed his son when no one else could. No, there was something deeper there, something Dominic wasn't sure how to put into words. It was late one evening, a few weeks after their heart-to-heart in the library, when Dominic found himself standing at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the lower level of the house. He could hear Swelly in the kitchen, her soft humming drifting up to where he stood. Something about the sound drew him in. It was the first time in a long while that he felt a sense of peace. He was used to hearing the sounds of the mansion, servants moving about, the hum of phones ringing, the quiet whispers of business being conducted in other rooms. But this was different. This was calm. Swelly had always carried that quiet calm with her. She was the anchor in the storm of his chaotic world. It wasn't just her actions with Marco. It was how she carried herself, how she made everything feel easier. It was in the way she did things without expecting thanks, how she was always there, always steady, always reliable. He couldn't deny it anymore. He needed to speak to her again. It wasn't just about Marco. It was about everything. As he made his way down the stairs, his thoughts raced. Was he ready to confront whatever this feeling was? Could he handle the vulnerability that came with it? When he entered the kitchen, he found Swelly sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, but there was a glint of something in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. "Sir?" she asked, her voice calm. Dominic swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how unsteady he felt. I wanted to ask you something," he said, his voice softer than usual. Swelly nodded, her gaze steady, waiting for him to continue. Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked before he could stop himself. Swelly blinked, clearly surprised by the question. "Leaving?" she repeated. Dominic nodded, his pulse quickening. "Yes. You've been here for so long. He faltered, unsure of how to continue. "I don't want to sound like I'm forcing you to stay, but I need to know if you're happy here." There was a long pause before Swelly finally answered, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm here because I choose to be here. And I'm happy doing what I do. Helping Marco, helping you, it gives me purpose." The words hit Dominic harder than he expected. He had never thought about it that way. She wasn't just here because it was her job. She was here because she wanted to be. "You choose this?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Swelly met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I do," she said softly. Dominic felt his heart ache as he processed her words. She had stayed all this time not out of necessity, not because she had to, but because she truly wanted to make a difference. She had chosen to care for Marco, chosen to be a part of their lives. He had never truly understood that before. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Swelly didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at him with those steady, knowing eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't need to say anything, Dominic. You've already said enough." Her words took him by surprise. What did she mean? He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You've been honest with me. You've acknowledged what I've done for you, for Marco. And for that, I'm grateful. But don't mistake that for something more than it is." The words stung, but Dominic knew she was right. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't expecting him to change, to offer more than he already had. She had given everything to them, expecting nothing in return. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, genuinely regretful. "I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable." Swelly gave him a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not uncomfortable. I've just always known where I stand." The words hit Dominic harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on his control, on knowing where everyone stood in his life. But with Swelly, he had never truly known. She had always been so much more than just a maid. And now, as he sat there with her, he realized that he had been blind to it for far too long. He had let her slip through his fingers, not recognizing the depth of her strength, her sacrifice, and her quiet love for Marco. "Thank you, Swelly," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, standing up from the table. "I'm just doing my job," she said again, her tone light. But there was something in her eyes that made him believe she was saying more than just those words. Dominic watched her leave the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange mix of hope and fear. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he couldn't let her go. Not this time. The weeks following their conversation in the kitchen were a blur for Dominic. The air between him and Swelly had shifted, but neither of them spoke of it again. Swelly continued with her daily routine, caring for Marco with a tenderness that Dominic couldn't ignore, but she seemed to keep her distance. Her eyes, though soft, didn't meet his as often, and he could see the walls she had carefully rebuilt around herself. Dominic wasn't sure what to do with the space she had created. He knew he couldn't force anything. He had spent so many years in control of every situation, but with Swelly, it was different. He didn't know what she wanted from him, if anything, and he couldn't bring himself to push her further. Yet, as the days went by, He found himself seeking her out more often. He would pass by the kitchen just to catch a glimpse of her, or sit in the study, hoping she would walk by. She had become a part of his world in ways he never imagined. His thoughts were consumed by her, not just because of what she had done for Marco, but because of how she had quietly redefined the space she occupied in his life. It wasn't until one evening, just before dinner, when Dominic found himself in the grand hall, staring at the rain through the windows, that he finally made a decision. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. He couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. He had to know where they stood. He had to talk to her, really talk to her, and find out what this strange tension was. Swelly was in the kitchen again, just as she always was, preparing food with her usual quiet efficiency. She had become the one constant in the house, always present, always reliable. But tonight, as Dominic stood in the doorway, he saw something different. There was a calmness in her movements, but also a sadness, a subtle weight to her actions that he hadn't noticed before. It was like she was carrying the world on her shoulders, even though she never showed it. He stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the marble floor. Swelly looked up at him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she quickly looked down. "Sir?" she asked, her voice calm and polite as always. Dominic stood still for a moment, unsure of how to start. But he knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low but firm. She didn't move, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe. "Of course," she said, setting the knife down. She turned toward him, folding her hands in front of her, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking," Dominic started, his words slow and deliberate, "about everything. About you, about Marco, about what we've become to each other." Swelly tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he added quickly, "but I can't keep pretending that nothing has changed, that I don't see the sacrifices you've made for this family." Swelly's lips parted as if to say something, but she stopped herself, her eyes dropping to the floor. Dominic noticed how her hands clenched together slightly. "You don't need to thank me," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do." Her words stung, and Dominic could feel the frustration building inside him. "But it's more than that," he said, his voice growing slightly more urgent. "You've done so much more than just your job. You've cared for Marco in ways I can't even explain. You've done things that no one else could have done. You've given him something, hope, love, that I couldn't give him." Swelly's shoulders tensed, and she took a small step back. "I'm just doing my job, Dominic," she repeated, her tone firm now, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. Dominic took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "No," he said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "You've given him your heart. And that's something no one else has been able to do. Not me, not anyone else. I've been too caught up in my own world to see it, but I see it now. I see you, and I can't keep pretending I don't." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Swelly stood there, frozen for a long moment, before she finally spoke. "You don't need to feel like you owe me anything, Dominic," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for Marco. Because he's a child. Because he deserves a chance to be happy, to be healthy. That's all." Dominic's chest tightened. She was still holding herself back, still keeping a part of herself hidden from him. But he couldn't let this moment pass. "I know you did it for Marco," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you did it for me too. And for the first time, I realize how much I've been missing. How much I've been taking for granted." He stepped closer to her, his heart pounding. "I don't want to take you for granted anymore. I don't want to ignore what you've done. And I don't want to pretend like I don't care about you." Swelly's eyes widened at his words, and for a moment, she looked like she was about to say something. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "I don't know what you want from me, Dominic," she said softly. "I've never asked for anything. I've always known where I stood." Dominic felt his heart sink. He had been so blind. So stupid. "I want to know where we stand," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I want to understand what this is between us. Because I can't keep pretending I don't feel something for you. Something more than just gratitude." Swelly didn't say anything, but her eyes softened, and for the first time, Dominic saw a flicker of hope in them, a hope that matched his own. And for the first time in a long while, Dominic felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The days after that conversation were tense, but transformative. Dominic felt something inside him change, but he wasn't sure what it meant yet. His relationship with Swelly was no longer the same. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken, but it weighed heavily on him. He had been open with her, confessed his feelings, but what did that mean for them? She had not rejected him, but she hadn't fully embraced him either. She was still distant in a way, careful with her words, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she hadn't completely shut him out. For Dominic, that was a victory. But as much as he wanted to take a step forward, he could feel the fear in himself, the fear of pushing too hard and losing what fragile connection they had. One evening, as he stood in his study looking over some papers, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Swelly. She had a way of moving silently, like a shadow in the corner of his world. "Sir?" she called softly, her voice breaking through the stillness of the room. Dominic looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met. He didn't know what it was, but the way she looked at him made something stir inside him, something deeper than just the desire to fix the mess he had created. "Swelly," he said, his voice softer than usual. She stayed standing by the door, unsure whether to approach. He could feel the hesitation in her, but he didn't want her to feel like she had to retreat. "Come in," he said gently. She nodded and stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. She remained standing a few feet away, her hands folded in front of her. Dominic noticed the way she held herself, her posture straight, her demeanor calm, but there was a slight tremble in her hands that she quickly hid. He realized then that she was just as uncertain as he was. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice hesitant. Swelly met his gaze, but didn't speak. She was waiting for him to continue. "About Marco, about everything," he added, the words coming out in a rush. "I know I've been distant. I know I've treated you like just someone in my employ, like you were invisible. But you've done something that no one else has been able to do. You've helped Marco, you've been there when I couldn't be, and I just—" He paused, struggling to find the words. "I can't keep pretending like I don't see you anymore." Swelly's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like hope, or maybe just curiosity. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I didn't do this for you, Dominic. I did it for Marco, because he needed me." Dominic nodded, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he expected. "I know," he said softly, "but I also know that you've been there for me too, in ways I didn't even realize." He stood up slowly, crossing the room toward her. "You've been here, day in and day out. You've given your time, your energy, your heart. And I can't keep pretending like I don't appreciate that." Swelly didn't move, but her gaze softened, just a little. "You don't need to say that," she replied, her voice still calm, but there was something vulnerable about the way she spoke. "I'm just doing my job." Dominic shook his head. "No, Swelly. It's not just your job. It's more than that. I see you. I see everything you've done. And I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with a kind of quiet tension, but it was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable, not like before. It was the kind of tension that came when two people finally stopped pretending. "You don't have to apologize," Swelly said, her voice quiet. "You didn't know? You're not the first person to overlook me. It's been my life for a long time. People see what they want to see." Dominic stepped closer, his heart pounding. "I'm not blind anymore, Swelly. I don't want to just see what I want to see. I want to see you. I want to understand you." There was a brief silence before Swelly spoke again. "You've already done that, Dominic. You've seen me. And I've seen you too. I know you're not the man you used to be." Her words hit him hard. He had spent so much of his life trying to be something he wasn't, trying to hold on to the image he had built. But now, in front of Swelly, he felt exposed, vulnerable. "I don't want to go back to who I was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't. Not now. Not after everything you've shown me." Swelly's eyes softened, and for the first time, she took a small step forward. "It's okay," she said gently. "You're not alone in this." Dominic looked at her, his heart aching. For so long, he had carried the weight of his world on his shoulders, trying to control everything, trying to stay in charge. But with Swelly, he felt something else, a connection, a partnership, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to find out. With you." Swelly nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. We'll figure it out together, she said quietly. In that moment, Dominic knew that whatever the future held, it would be different. With Swelly by his side, the world didn't seem so impossible to face anymore. After that night, things began to change in subtle ways. The house still had its usual rhythm, Dominic's meetings, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. But now there was a quiet shift. A sense of understanding had settled between him and Swelly, a peace that was unfamiliar but welcome. The distance that had once defined their relationship no longer existed. Still, neither of them said much about what had happened. It was as if they both knew that words weren't necessary, that the silence they shared was enough for now. But Dominic couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding between them. He had spent so much of his life fighting for control, building his empire on power and fear, but now he found himself in a situation where he had no idea what came next. He had always known how to navigate his world, but this was different. And in a way, he welcomed the uncertainty. As the days passed, he found himself seeking Swelly out more often. He'd find reasons to be in the kitchen, asking about Marco's meals, about how she was doing, just so he could be close to her. He was drawn to her in a way he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was something deeper, something real. One evening, after a long day, Dominic found himself standing in front of the grand fireplace in the living room, watching the flames flicker. He couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept drifting back to Swelly, to the way she had become such an integral part of his life, to the way her presence made everything feel better. He was still unsure of what it all meant, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't lose her. He turned toward the door when he heard footsteps approaching. It was Swelly. She was holding a tray with some food, her usual calm demeanor in place, but there was a slight hesitation in her step. When she saw him, she paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. There was a moment of silence, and then she spoke. "I made some dinner for you, sir," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of something, nervousness. "Thank you," Dominic said, his voice softer than usual. He could see the slight flush on her cheeks, and it made something stir in him. He took a step closer. "You don't have to call me sir anymore, Swelly," he said, the words coming out before he had time to think. "I don't want you to feel like you have to keep that distance between us." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something, surprise, maybe, or hope. "What should I call you then?" she asked quietly. Dominic hesitated, unsure of the answer. But then it hit him, clear as day. "Dominic," he said, his voice gentle. "Call me Dominic." There was a long silence as she processed his words. She didn't say anything for a moment, and just when Dominic thought she might pull away, she spoke again. "All right, Dominic." The way she said his name, so simply, made his heart race. It was as if, in that moment, everything had shifted, like they had crossed some invisible line, and now they were standing on equal ground. He didn't want to overthink it, but he couldn't help it. The connection they had built over the past few weeks was real. He felt it in his bones. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Swelly nodded, looking down at the tray she was holding. "It's just my job," she said quietly, but there was no longer the same detachment in her voice. Now it sounded softer, more personal. Dominic stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "No, it's not just your job," he said firmly. "You've done so much more than that, and I need you to know that I see it." She opened her mouth as if to say something, but she stopped herself, her eyes searching his. "I don't expect anything in return," she said, her voice quiet, but with a sincerity that struck him. Dominic's heart ached at her words. He could see the walls she had built around herself, the way she had kept herself guarded, not just from him, but from everyone. But in that moment, he wanted nothing more than to break down those walls, to show her that he wasn't like the others. He wasn't just some man who would take her for granted. "You don't have to expect anything," he said gently. "You've already given more than I could ever ask for." There was another long pause, and Dominic could feel the tension between them. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind anymore. It was something new, something that felt like the beginning of something real. Swelly took a step closer, her eyes searching his face. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice low. "I can see it, but I don't know if I can trust it." Dominic's chest tightened at her words, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had to prove himself to her, to show her that what he was offering was real. You don't have to trust me right away, he said softly. But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. I want to see where this goes. With you. Swelly's eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Dominic felt a warmth spread through him, and in that moment, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. He wasn't sure how long it would take for Swelly to fully trust him, but he was willing to wait. For her. For them. And as he watched her leave the room that night, something inside him told him that this was only the beginning. The days after their quiet conversation felt different. The air between them was no longer thick with uncertainty. It wasn't that everything had been sorted or that all the walls between them had been torn down, but it was a start. Dominic didn't expect everything to change overnight, but he could feel the shift in the way they interacted. He was no longer just the employer, and Swelly wasn't just the maid. It was as if they were standing on the edge of something neither of them fully understood yet. The emotional distance that had once defined their relationship was now replaced with something new, something both fragile and profound. They still exchanged the usual pleasantries, and Swelly still did her work with the same quiet grace. But there was an unspoken connection between them that neither could ignore. For the first time in a long time, Dominic felt both vulnerable and hopeful. He had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to control his surroundings, to never show weakness. But with Swelly, he had let down his guard, and she hadn't turned away. In fact, she had done the opposite. She had given him a glimpse of something real, something he hadn't even known he was missing. Marco, too, had felt the change. The boy had grown attached to Swelly, of course, but now there was an even deeper bond between them. It was as though the house itself had begun to settle into a quieter, more peaceful rhythm, thanks to the quiet strength Swelly had brought into their lives. And Dominic couldn't deny it any longer. He was starting to care about her, more than he ever thought he could. But there was still so much between them that had not been addressed. The unspoken questions, the uncertainties, the fears, they all lingered. Dominic knew that he couldn't hide from them much longer. He had to know where they stood, or he would risk losing everything. One evening, as the mansion grew quiet and the sun set behind the tall windows, Dominic found himself in the study again, his thoughts consumed by the same questions that had been gnawing at him for weeks. He heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and without looking up, he knew it was Swelly. He didn't need to see her to know she was there. He had become so attuned to her presence, her quiet energy, that it was almost as if she were a part of the room itself. "Dominic," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet uncertainty. He looked up, surprised to hear her say his name like that. It had been a small shift, but it struck him deeply. "Can we talk?" she asked, stepping into the room. Dominic stood, his heart pounding, but he tried to keep his calm. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. He motioned to the chair across from his desk, and she took a seat, her hands folded in her lap. The space between them felt charged with anticipation. Swelly took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything you said," she began, her eyes meeting his. "And I need to be honest with you, Dominic." Dominic nodded, his chest tightening. "I'm listening," he said, trying to keep his voice as even as possible. "I don't know what this is between us," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what you want from me. I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for. I've spent so many years keeping my distance, building walls around myself. It's not easy for me to let anyone in. Not after everything I've been through." Dominic felt his heart ache at her words. He knew she had been through things he could never fully understand, and he realized how little he had truly known about her life. She had always been the strong, silent type, but now, sitting across from her, he saw the cracks in her armor. He saw the pain she carried with her every day. "I don't want to rush you," he said softly. "I don't want you to feel like you have to give me anything. I just want you to know that I care, and I want to understand. I want to be there for you the way you've been there for Marco." Swelly's eyes softened at his words, but she still looked unsure. "I don't know how to be vulnerable, Dominic. I've spent my whole life keeping my emotions in check. I've learned to survive without expecting anything from anyone." Dominic took a step closer, his heart racing. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to keep it all inside. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just asking you to trust me, to let me be there for you." For a long moment, Swelly didn't say anything. Her gaze dropped to her hands, and Dominic could see the struggle in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, he could tell, but she was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again. Afraid of letting someone in. "I've never trusted anyone the way I'm starting to trust you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared, Dominic. I'm scared of what this means." Dominic reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm scared too," he said softly. "But I'm not going anywhere. I promise you." There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding. Swelly looked up at him, her eyes filled with something new, something soft, something hopeful. And in that moment, Dominic knew that this was just the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, still things they needed to figure out, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them. With her. Together. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of tension, but it wasn't the kind Dominic was used to. The usual worries of running his empire and controlling everything seemed to have melted into the background. Instead, he found himself constantly thinking about Swelly, her quiet strength, and the way she had entered his life in ways he never expected. Her presence was no longer just about her work. It was about something deeper. He was beginning to realize that he had never truly understood what she meant to him. She had become an integral part of the family. But as the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more than just acknowledge it. He needed to act on it. He knew they had started something. Something fragile, something meaningful, but he didn't know where it was headed. Was it possible for them to have something more than just this quiet understanding? Could he truly open his heart after so many years of guarding it? There was still so much uncertainty between them. The fear of getting too close was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But as he thought about it, Dominic knew that he couldn't continue to live in this half-state of wanting more, but holding back. He needed to find out if Swelly felt the same way, or if he was simply reading too much into everything. He knew the risk of pushing too hard, but the thought of losing what they had started was too much to bear. One evening, as the mansion grew quiet and the usual hum of activity slowed down, Dominic found himself walking through the hallways, unsure of where he was going. His thoughts kept drifting back to Swelly. He couldn't deny it anymore. He had to talk to her. And so, he found himself in the kitchen, where she was preparing a light meal for herself. The smell of fresh bread and soup filled the air, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade away. Swelly was there, calm as always, but Dominic could see the quiet exhaustion in her eyes. She hadn't looked at him yet, but he could feel the tension between them, even in the stillness of the room. He stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of her, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he spoke. "Swelly," he said, his voice soft, yet firm. "Can we talk?" She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, an uncertainty, maybe, or an understanding that she hadn't been ready to face before. "Of course," she replied quietly, wiping her hands on a towel before walking over to him. They stood there, facing each other in the quiet kitchen, the air between them thick with anticipation. "I've been thinking," Dominic started, trying to steady his nerves. "About everything that's happened. About us." Swelly tilted her head slightly, a soft but inquisitive expression crossing her face. "I don't know where this is going, Swelly," he continued. "But I know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want to pretend anymore. I want to be honest with you. I care about you." Swelly's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything right away. Dominic could see that she was processing his words, trying to understand his intentions. "I've never been good at this," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I've spent so many years pushing people away, trying to control everything. But with you it's different." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't want to hide from this anymore. I don't want to pretend like I don't care." Swelly stood still, her lips slightly parted, but she still didn't speak. Dominic felt his heart pounding in his chest. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he added softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I just want you to know that I see you, that I appreciate everything you've done, and I want to know if you feel the same way." Swelly's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something in them. A vulnerability, a hint of something deeper. She took a deep breath, as though preparing to say something important. "I've always kept my distance," she said quietly. "I've been afraid of getting too close, afraid of letting someone in. But with you," she trailed off, her gaze shifting down to the floor for a moment. Dominic's heart ached. With me, he repeated softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked back up at him, her expression now softer, more open. With you, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. I feel safe. I feel like maybe, just maybe, I don't have to carry everything alone. Dominic took another step closer to her, his breath caught in his chest. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're not alone, Swelly, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not anymore. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Hope? Trust? She didn't say anything, but the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt like the beginning of something new, something real. For the first time, Dominic felt like he wasn't just trying to fix things. He wasn't trying to control anything. He was just standing there, with her, and that was enough. Swelly stepped closer, and for the first time in a long time, Dominic felt like he was finally where he was meant to be, together. In the weeks that followed their conversation in the kitchen, things between Dominic and Swelly continued to change, though neither of them openly acknowledged it. The distance between them had narrowed, but they both remained careful not to rush what was unfolding. Their interactions were softer, more genuine, but still marked with a sense of uncertainty. Dominic couldn't shake the thought that something was growing between them, something both delicate and real. He had spent years building his empire on a foundation of control and fear, but Swelly had become the calm in the storm of his life. It wasn't just gratitude for her caring for Marco, though that alone had shifted his view of her. It was more than that. She had given him something he had never expected: peace, understanding, and the possibility of something beyond the cold, hard world he had created for himself. As much as he had grown to care for her, Dominic knew that he had to let things unfold naturally, without forcing them. Swelly had her own way of dealing with things, a quiet strength that allowed her to navigate life with grace and purpose. But the fear of losing her, of not being brave enough to explore what could be, lingered in the back of his mind. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky with vibrant hues of orange and pink, Dominic found himself sitting by the large windows in the study, staring out at the view. The mansion was quiet, with only the soft hum of the city in the distance breaking the silence. It had been a long day filled with meetings and decisions, but his mind kept returning to Swelly. He had been avoiding her for the past few days, unsure of how to proceed. But that evening, something inside him shifted. He couldn't hold back any longer. He needed to be honest with her, to let her know what he was feeling. He rose from his chair and made his way toward the kitchen. He found her there, as usual, preparing something simple, as though the world outside didn't exist. Swelly turned when she heard him enter, a small, tentative smile on her face. But Dominic could see the wariness in her eyes, the same hesitation that he had been feeling. Swelly, he said softly, his voice almost trembling, we need to talk. She set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables and looked at him. What's on your mind, Dominic? Her voice was calm, but there was a layer of tension beneath the words. He hesitated for a moment, but then took a step forward, his heart pounding. I can't keep pretending that I don't care about you, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. I can't pretend that I don't feel something deeper for you, something I didn't expect, something I didn't think I was capable of. Swelly looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady but unreadable. I don't want to rush anything, he continued, his hands clasped together as though he was trying to hold onto the words. But I also don't want to leave things unsaid. He paused, taking a deep breath. Swelly, I care about you, more than I've ever cared about anyone, and I need to know if you feel the same. Swelly was silent for a long moment, and for the first time, Dominic felt completely vulnerable. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can give you the same answer you're looking for, Dominic, she said, her eyes looking down for a brief moment. I've spent so much of my life protecting myself, keeping my distance. I've been afraid to let anyone in because I've always been alone, and I don't know if I can change that. Dominic's heart ached at her words. He understood. He had built his own walls, but she had built hers long before they ever met. I'm not asking you to change, Swelly, he said gently. I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm just asking you to see that I'm here, that I care. She raised her eyes to meet his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen before, hope. I see you, Dominic, she said softly. I do. And maybe we can take this one step at a time. His heart swelled at her words. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, that there would be challenges ahead, but he was willing to face them with her. Slowly, as if testing the waters, he reached out and gently touched her hand. Swelly didn't pull away. Instead, she gave him a small, tentative smile, one that spoke more than words ever could. "We'll figure this out together," she said. In that moment, Dominic realized that this was it. This was the beginning of something real, something worth fighting for. They weren't there yet, but they were on the path, and for the first time in a long time, Dominic felt a sense of peace he had never known before. It wasn't about control anymore. It wasn't about power. It was about connection, about being present with each other, about trusting each other to move forward, one step at a time.